Well, I want to welcome you to this event. Today, we're talking about Methane Systems 101, addressing the oil and gas pollution ecosystem. And we'll be talking about a few different rules that have been proposed that we think will help with some of these issues. And we'll talk about some health issues and things like that. So I am going to pass it over to our first speaker, Vanessa Lynch.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to work to share my screen here. All right. So I'm Vanessa Lynch. I am a field organizer with Moms Clean Air Force. And today we're going to be talking about Methane 101. And my part of the discussion will be about EPA's proposed safeguards and human health. Just to introduce you a little bit to Moms Clean Air Force, we're a community of over 1.5 million moms and dads united against air pollution and the urgent crisis of our changing climate to equitably protect children's health. And really the core of that is just connecting communities that are experiencing air pollution and frontline impacts with conversations about our changing climate and really advocating for equitable protections. So I just want to start by talking a little bit about oil and gas air pollution. The two main parts of oil and gas air pollution that we're really going to focus on today are methane, which is the primary component in natural gas, and volatile organic compounds, which can be found anywhere that methane is being leaked in the fracking process. The types of programs right now that we have that are working to protect communities and really address methane pollution are the EPA safeguards that I'll be talking about, state implementation plans, federal methane pollution reduction plans, and local protections can also have a big impact. The reason I bring up these things and why we at Moms and myself included think this is really important are pictures like this one. This is Olivia at Summit Elementary School at the playground there in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. And her school is about 700 feet from this fracking well pad, but the playground is much, much closer. I'm going to share a video with you that I think sort of sums up why this is so important for us to act on.
Climate change directly impacts my future.
Our elected leaders have a responsibility to do their part to cut the air pollution causing climate change.
Oil and gas operations across the nation create methane pollution, a potent greenhouse gas that contributes to the climate crisis.
This is an enormous fossil fuel pollution problem.
I have a right to breathe clean air. I have the right to safely play outside.
I have a right to a bright future with a family of my own.
We must stop climate change in its tracks.
My generation will inherit the climate change problems that you create today.
For me.
For my family.
For my parents and grandparents.
It's time to do the right thing.
Act on climate change and protect us from methane pollution now.
We are depending on you.
So I think that really messages from our children and really thinking about the frontline impacts of oil and gas air pollution is one of the most important ways that we can really conceptualize what's going on in Pennsylvania and Ohio and in states like ours. Just a little bit of background on methane. As I said, it is the primary component in natural gas, but it's also a greenhouse gas, and it's responsible for 25% of current climate change. It's significant. And what makes it even more significant and why it is so important to the near-term conversation is methane is over 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. So when we're talking about greenhouse gases and the work that we want to do to decrease this kind of pollution and climate impacts, methane has a huge part to play in that conversation. As I mentioned, where methane is released, volatile organic compounds are also released, and these are really the health-harming chemicals that come from fracking. Volatile organic compounds can affect health, and they include things like benzene, which is a cancer causer. And they also contribute to ground level ozone or smog, which can cause asthma attacks or respiratory problems. And this is a map, I think it's so important when we're talking about these things to understand who they're impacting. This is a map of my local community. And this is a well pad near a park where my kids used to play soccer and softball, and a stream that they love to play in. And our home is also within this map sphere. So you can see that these kinds of impacts really do affect real people, and those of us on the front line have a real vested interest in why we're doing this work and why this work's so important. I think too, when we're talking about fracking, people often think of just a small, simple action. These are all pictures from my own personal community of everything from the well pad site to sound barriers to clear cutting that occurred to be able to put in pipelines to truck traffic to pipelines for water and compressor stations. It's a whole group of things that are brought to a community when fracking occurs. And I think it's also really important to understand that each of those parts and all of those parts combined have a serious health impact. And so these are some of the air pollutants that are part of this process, and that the different types of health impacts that they can cause. And I think, we really at Moms focus a lot on the health of women and children. And you can see for pregnant women, things like low birth weight, preterm birth, high risk pregnancies, cancer, neural tube defects, and congenital heart defects are all possible side effects or health impacts of the oil and gas pollution that occurs in communities. So what exactly is in this proposed EPA rule, and what safeguards are they really looking at? Requiring routine leak monitoring at every well site and compressor station. So it's really important that we not just look at new well pads or fracking, but that we also look at existing or older infrastructure. And so this rule really brings all of those into the fold, which is really important when we're talking about frontline impacts and when we're talking about climate change impacts. Requiring pneumatic pumps to have zero emissions. So pneumatic pumps are just a part of the mechanics of the oil and gas process, but what we know is these pumps have for many years allowed a certain amount of leakage on purpose. And we now have technologies that can choose to have no leakage. And that is what this is about. And it's really important that we stop leaks throughout the process of the oil and gas infrastructure. And this rule is taking a look at pneumatic pumps, and we will want that to be a really strong part of this rule as it's finalized. This safeguard rule really creates something new. It's a super emitter response program. This is a great program that is really focused on big events, big leaks, and how we get those stopped as quickly as possible. Strengthening requirements for, sorry about that. Strengthening requirements and then preventing pollution at abandoned and unplugged wells. So these are all the main parts that are included in the EPA's proposed rulemaking. They are being finalized as we speak and should be coming out any day now in their final form. These safeguards will provide us with some true cut methane wins. EPA says that they think that methane pollution would be would be reduced by 87% in the covered sources as compared with 2005 levels with this rule. They think that we can avoid 9.7 million tons of smog-forming VOCs from 2023 to 2035, and pollutants like benzene and toluene, which are all have serious health impacts. And really, this is a part of a bigger picture and why we wanted to have this conversation. The EPA safeguards are one piece, but EPA points out, and I think rightly so, that the Clean Air Act standards in this proposal work hand in hand with Inflation Reduction Act programs, incentivizing the implementation of methane reduction and supports methane mitigation. And that these complementary efforts, so all of the things that you'll hear about today, will allow us to achieve greater methane pollution reductions more quickly. And for frontline communities like mine, I know that is really the most important part of this conversation. This is a picture of me and my family and some other Pennsylvania frontline impacted residents who had gone to DC to talk about what we were experiencing in our communities. So that's the end of my presentation, and I will pass it back to Kim to introduce our next presenter.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's great to hear from somebody who's actually been impacted and see some of those pictures directly from the field. Our next speaker today is going to be John Ruttecki, who's going to talk about something that we call MERP.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Vanessa. Very excited to be here. So obviously, thank you for taking the time to join us today. We want to make sure we provide you with some really important information. So let me try to share my screen here, and then we will get moving along. I think it's important when we're highlighting what Vanessa has been talking about, that we show a little context to the work that she does as a frontline community member, ensuring that this advocacy is taking place. So let's see if I can. All right. So to introduce myself, my name is John Ruttecki. I'm a regulatory and legislative manager in the Appalachian region for Environmental Defense Fund. So Environmental Defense Fund's a global nonprofit that is working on tackling climate change. We obviously view this as the greatest challenge of our time, and so we're trying to take as much bold action to find solutions as we can, and obviously working to keep people at the center of this. So I think it's very important, obviously, that we connect with you and the interest that you have. So I'm here to talk about the methane emissions reduction program. You heard Vanessa talk about the Inflation Reduction Act and other supportive materials that happen to help with the work that we're doing in our advocacy around driving down methane emissions. So the acronym is MERP, but that is recognizing that it's a confusing one, Methane Emissions Reduction Program. So as we know, we're coming off another record year, a record summer of breaking heat. So we know that climate action can't wait. So we are all hunting for solutions. You're here on a webinar to hear about solutions. Want to make sure we present you with things that can deliver on the speed and scale that we're looking for. So as more and more attention is being paid to reducing oil and gas methane emissions as a crucial part of a climate reduction approach, I wanted to share some information prior to talking about MERP of a new report released by the International Energy Agency. They confirmed that in order to prevent the worst impacts of climate change, we have to rapidly cut oil and gas methane emissions alongside obviously reducing demand. So as you may know, COP28 is going to be starting on Thursday. And so oil and gas methane is really going to be a hot issue when they're having that discussion. And so obviously, as Vanessa highlighted, the Environmental Protection Agency will be finalizing new regulations for reducing those emissions from the oil and gas industry. So what that report confirmed was that we have to rapidly do this. The only way that we can meet our 1.5 degrees centigrade or lower temperature rise is by also including regulatory actions around reductions in methane. So how do we solve our methane problem? Well, we need to accurately understand the scale of it. So luckily, we have the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's going to help us do both of these things. So part of that is the Methane Emissions Reduction Program, MERP. So the great part about this is that it has us primed as the United States to be a worldwide leader on this urgent issue. So the important element of all this, though, so let's describe MERP to you. So once again, how do we solve the problem? The program has three main components in MERP that will help cut methane from oil and gas production. One is new funding for methane emissions reductions. Another is an update to emissions reporting requirements. And the third is a new waste charge for especially excessive methane emissions. So this is great because the government is providing federal funding and it's helping cut methane and it's also creating jobs. So specifically, what is MERP? So Congress in the Inflation Reduction Act allocated $1.5 billion to fund MERP. From that funding, just recently, they've announced $350 million that will go to plug and help abate methane problems from marginal conventional wells. And those are lower producing wells that we have found are driving a lot of the pollution we are experiencing. So that's going to be a really climate friendly action that will create jobs. We don't know yet what the rest of the funding will be used for. We're obviously advocating on behalf of what we could use that funding for, helping regulatory agencies work towards states complying. But that will be rolled out over time and then obviously in service of further reducing emissions and obviously the need to support communities that are impacted by this pollution. So obviously this funding can make a huge difference in the lives of people who live near oil and gas operations, the frontline communities that Vanessa mentioned. So they've been bearing the health costs of this pollution. So bold investment in these communities will really improve their health outcomes and help revitalize rural economies. So that was, what this new funding is. So what is an update to emissions reporting requirements? Well, this program will also require, MERP will also require the EPA to update its greenhouse gas reporting requirements. So this is obviously a crucial element because what we found is what typically happens is oil and gas operators will provide estimates, report their estimated pollution to the EPA. And that's called Subpart W, little technical stuff for you, but it's obviously important because unfortunately those methods those requirements rely on methods that are outdated and they're not accurately reflective of the true scale of pollution. So EDF has been engaged with many scientific studies that found that based on actual measurement of methane emissions when we take them at the physical sites as opposed to estimating them are much higher than what gets reported currently under Subpart W. So thanks to the IRA and the MERP program in general, or thanks to the MERP program and the IRA in general, the EPA is actually working on updating these reporting standards. So new requirements, these new requirements will, take a much, we'll take a look at our modern understanding of emissions and help provide a clearer picture of actual emissions. So that way we can actually better manage the pollution. So ensuring big pollution events, which Vanessa mentioned, also called super emitters, are reported to the EPA. We find that to be very important. So we know where improvements need to be made in this process. So we have a few recommendations, obviously happy to follow up further as far as where EDF weighed in on the reporting standards and what we feel is necessary to be included in that Subpart W revision. So that is the update to the emissions reporting. And then what is a waste charge and what is excessive methane emissions? So, oops, oh, there we go. I guess I should have kept moving forward. That would be a good part to do. So the waste charge, what it is a fee on excessive methane emissions. And when operators exceed that industry aligned, and it's called an intensity threshold. Sorry to throw out another technical term, but it just looks at the total amount of methane emissions and provides a correlated number to that with where they will pay a fee on anything over 25,000 tons of pollution. So obviously this will become an essential tool in the work that we're doing, because this will hold polluters accountable and will lead to efficiency improvements for operators. So we're, in a sense, incentivizing them in a way to, track their waste more carefully. But we, feel it's an essential tool for accountability, as you see here, so we can ensure that, we target those largest methane emitters. So ones that emit, once again, 25,000 tons of methane, or tons of climate pollution, I guess is the simpler way to put it. So smaller operators who are in compliance with the EPA's methane standards will be exempt from this rulemaking, but they still will be crucial as far as us understanding the scope of the methane problem that we see right now. So we, truly feel that the IRA is a landmark piece of climate legislation. We think MERP is a really forward-thinking approach to methane emissions, and it may prove to be one of the most important legacies that we're, having here in recent time as far as addressing the climate crisis. And why is that? Because truly everyone that's on this call and the work that we do in methane recognizes that if we are able to cut methane, it's really going to be one of the most important climate solutions we can have. And obviously, thanks to Congress, we're in a position to become a global leader and protect communities from pollution. So really appreciate your time, obviously, and we'll be available for questions after. But thank you for your time, and I will turn it back to Kim for our next speaker.
Thank you, John. And I am your next speaker, so give me a second while I share my screen. So my name is Kim Anderson, and I'm Associate Director of Outreach for Ohio and Pennsylvania for the Evangelical Environmental Network. And our tagline is "Creation Care is a Matter of Life." When we talk about these issues, it's health and children's health that we care about, much like the issues that Vanessa shared about earlier. So today I'm going to be talking about the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, which we'll call PHMSA for short during this presentation. When the methane rule falls under the EPA, this falls under the U.S. Department of Transportation. And the mission of PHMSA is to protect people and the environment by advancing the safe transportation of energy and other hazardous materials that are essential to our daily lives. Previous versions of the rule focused on safety, in other words, lack of explosions. Well, this rule focuses a little bit more on emissions and pollution, which has health impacts. So basically, under the rule, you've got two buckets of categories that we're going to talk about today. First is pipelines, and second is storage. And if you live in an area where there is oil and gas production like me, you can drive down the road and see these things every day of your lives. So we're going to talk about a couple of different types of pipelines. First, we have gathering pipelines, and basically these move the product from the source to storage or processing. They carry unprocessed gas, and today there are over 430,000 miles of these pipelines in the United States. And then we have transmission lines, which are kind of like gas highways that transport large amounts of processed gas over large distances. And most of these pipelines are actually underground. And then finally, we have distribution lines, which move the gas to industrial customers, businesses, and homes. So if you own a home, you might be aware of the gas line that connects you to the gas pipeline in your street, and might be aware of that. We're going to talk a little bit about domestic and state pipelines. In the United States, there's about 2.6 million miles of pipelines. In Ohio, that amounts to around 68,000. In Pennsylvania, around 58,000 miles of pipelines. In the United States, there's a little bit more than half of the world's total oil and gas pipelines are found in the Americas. So we do have a pretty strong infrastructure of pipelines here in the United States. I want to talk a little bit about a leak that happened in a pipeline. You can see it highlighted there in Wood County, Ohio, and northwestern Ohio. There was a leak that was an unintentional release of product from an underground gas pipeline, and it leaked about 50,000 gallons of gasoline. That's a kind of abstract number. So to put it into perspective, that's about enough to drive an average car over 1.1 million miles. So we're talking about a lot of gas that leaked. As a result, there was contaminated soil that needed to be removed. They needed to make sure that the the product didn't get into the stream, and that the water of local drinking residents wasn't contaminated. Between 1986 and 2014, in nearly 30 years, pipeline accidents have spilled around 76,000 barrels a year, which amounts to, in that time period, about 3 million gallons, which is similar to those propane tanks that some people use for barbecues over the summer. It's about 1.2 million tanks of propane for an average gas grill. There were about nearly 8,000 incidents, or about 300 per year, which resulted in 500 deaths, or more than 2,300 injuries, and $7 billion in damage. So why do we use pipelines? Basically, they're regarded as being safer than transporting oil via trucks. But based on fertility statistics, oil pipelines are about 70 times as safe as trucks. But when a pipeline does fail, the results can be catastrophic. And as pipelines are exposed to the elements and infrastructure gets older, there will be leaks that can be dangerous. And the same is true for underground storage wells as well. And from a historical perspective, many of these wells were used for drilling and for extracting fuel. And then once they were empty, they were started to use as storage. And the primary purpose of storage is to provide gas during the winter seasons when it's harder to transport and things like this. So it is very important for our year-round comfort and having heat in the coldest times of the year. I mentioned that many of these were used for underground storage historically. This also means that the age of the wells is pretty old. Most of the wells were drilled before 1979, but I've read about wells that are as old as 1940 and 1950. And if you think about that metal and corrosion and things that can happen over time, you can see how they would quickly start to break down. These older wells were constructed during the time when there were fewer regulations, there was more primitive technology, and they're more vulnerable to natural degradation forces like corrosion and cement breakdown. Many of these wells are in places that are pretty heavily populated, like Stark County and Summit County, Wayne County in Ohio, and Allegheny County in Pennsylvania. In the state of Pennsylvania, there's about 48 of these underground storage wells, most of them in Southwest Pennsylvania. In Ohio, there are about 300,000 residents that live within 650 feet of one of these storage wells. And I would like to talk a little bit about a leak that happened with one of these wells in my county. I live in Cambria County, Pennsylvania. And in November of 2022, there was a storage well that leaked, and the company was unable to plug it for various reasons. Some of it was because of the aging infrastructure for about 11 days. In the picture on the left, you can see there's an aerial photo that shows how far the methane was able to leak away from the site. And the picture on the right, obviously you can't see the underground storage tank, but you can see the methane leaking out of the ground where the well failed. In the 11 days, this well leaked about 1.16 billion cubic feet of methane. And that's about 7,200 tanker trucks of gasoline. So it's a lot of methane that was leaked into the atmosphere right here where I live and where families play. And my child had a soccer friend who lived right down the road from this. The company recently identified that the cause of the leak was water and oxygen-induced corrosion. So this is an example of when these things leak, they will, as they age, we will start to have more and more problems with them. So the bottom line when we're talking about pipelines and storage wells is leaks can result in lost cost. Anytime there is gas that's leaking from a pipeline or a storage well, it's fuel that could have been used to power our homes or our automobiles and things like that. They can also have negative health impacts like Vanessa talked about. They can be severe for the people that live around them. And this really just to me points to the fact that we need proper oversight of the wells. So that's where the Department of Transportation proposed updated rule for PHMSA comes in. There are basically 4 elements of this rule. They want to have increased leak detection and repair, mitigation of venting and blowdowns, which are routine maintenance, but making sure that we're doing that in a better way, improved transparency, and then expanded coverage of gathering pipelines. And I personally and other people think that we also need to add underground storage wells in there. PHMSA, when they came out with the updated rule, said that they're going to focus on pipelines. And at this point, they're not focusing as much on storage wells. And having lived through seeing what this can do to a community, I really strongly believe that we need to add this and some other safeguards as well. I have a video, but I was unable to get my sound to share, so I will share it in the chat. That it kind of gives an overview of the leak that happened in my county, and just kind of tells the story in a little more visually. So now I'm going to pass it on to my friend Tracy Sabetta with Moms Clean Air Force.
Thanks so much, Kim. I am Tracy Sabetta with Moms Clean Air Force. I'm a field organizer in Ohio, just outside of the Columbus area. I've been with Moms Clean Air Force since 2011. And in Ohio, we work primarily on local, state, and federal policy dealing with climate change and clean energy. And today, I am going to talk to you a little bit about the state of oil and gas production in Ohio. Just share my screen with you here. Okay. Sorry about that. So let's talk a little bit, as mentioned, about the state of oil and gas production in Ohio. So Ohio continues to be a major natural gas producing state that covers both the Utica and Marcellus shale. And according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, oil and gas production in Ohio in 2021 was actually 29 times greater than it was in 2010. The state has also, unfortunately, renewed its commitment to oil and gas fracking on public lands and in state parks. As you may have seen, we're currently home to more than 103,000 oil and gas production facilities. About 3 million Ohioans, which is roughly 25%, live within a mile of oil and gas wells. Many of those most heavily impacted live just downwind of those facilities. In fact, Ohio ranks within the top 5 states with the highest impacts from oil and gas production. We also know that natural gas waste is taking an economic toll on Ohio. A new study shows that in 2019, Ohio saw $93 million worth of gas wasted, and that is enough to meet the annual needs of 11% of residential natural gas customers in the state. Oil and gas operators are also avoiding paying the taxes and royalties on that natural gas, so federal and state governments are losing revenue. In 2019, the lost potential revenue amounted to $1.4 million in Ohio, and that is revenue that would have gone to a variety of programs, including plugging orphan oil and gas wells. So in addition to those economic benefits, we know that there are incredible public health impacts from methane pollution in Ohio. So a new study that was led by Boston University School of Public Health, the University of North Carolina Institute for the Environment and Environmental Defense Fund found that air pollution from the oil and gas sector has a substantial adverse impact on air quality, human health, and healthcare costs. This study revealed that in 2016, oil and gas production in Ohio caused 349 early deaths and exacerbated asthma in 15,500 children in the state. So the American Lung Association tells us that there are 152,000 children in Ohio who have asthma, which means that methane pollution negatively touched more than 1 in 10 of our youngest population. So we know that methane contributes significantly to climate change pollution and accelerates those impacts. And we've seen records for overnight temperatures were recently broken in 4 Ohio cities, with Toledo, Akron, Mansfield, and Findlay setting records for the average minimum summer temperatures. In 2022, Columbus had nearly 20 days of summer where the temperature hit or exceeded 90 degrees, above normal for June through August, and reflects many nights where the low temperature never drops below the 70s. Now, what that does is it taxes cooling systems and impacts those Ohio residents who don't have access to air conditioning. It impacts those with asthma and other respiratory problems. It impacts electric bills and people's health. It doesn't allow a home to naturally cool overnight. So when you add all of this together, plus the power outages that Ohio has seen over the last 2 years, you really have a climate change recipe for disaster. So some of the other health impacts that we've seen is, as Vanessa mentioned earlier, oil and gas production sites emit volatile organic compounds and hazardous air pollutants alongside methane that worsen this public health. And according to a report from Asthma and Allergy Foundation, Cleveland ranks number 4 among their asthma capitals. This is something that I know some of you who are with us today have experienced firsthand living in Northeast Ohio. While we have seen some improvement in Northeast Ohio when it comes to particulate matter, really looking at the impacts of asthma in that area shows us the harmful impacts of methane pollution and where we can go from here. So in addition, oil and gas production releases toxic pollutions that can lead to serious public health impacts, such as increased incidence of cancer. And in the study that I mentioned previously, it was found that air pollution in 2016 from the oil and gas sector in the United States resulted in $77 billion in total public health impacts. So you have heard a little bit about the federal methane rule that is to really be released soon, but what does that mean for the states, for individual states like Ohio? It's going to require the development of a state implementation plan, or a SIP. And because as you've noticed, we shorten everything and use lots and lots of letters all the time. So we're going to do our best to make sure we explain those as we go along. But what is a SIP and why is it so important? So state implementation plans are developed to demonstrate how that state is going to enforce the goals that are set forth in the rules. It's going to include state level regulations, permits, measures, other documentation that go into developing this implementation plan for states. And while states may adopt their own regulations that exceed federal requirements, we really hope that states, especially like Ohio and Pennsylvania, who are so greatly impacted by oil and gas production and methane pollution, will take the time necessary to develop strong implementation plans that are specifically tailored to their states. Now, if a state chooses not to develop its own plan, they will have a plan developed for them by the US EPA, and there are possible sanctions that can come along with that if they don't develop a plan, or if their plan is not strong enough to meet the requirements of the rule. But once you develop a plan, it's not the only plan that you get. SIPs can be revised, in fact, should be revised. And when they make those revisions, the packages are available for public comment and must be resubmitted to the EPA. Now, we've talked a little bit about what is a SIP. The question is why? Why do you need them? What's an example of what happens when either you don't have one or you don't have one that is adequate to enforce the goals of the rule that's issued? And in Ohio, there's sort of an anecdotal SIP story that I have heard for years, and I don't know if it's true, but I think it really illustrates the point beautifully. So in Ohio, between 1970 and 77, there was a rule in the Clean Air Act that required reduction in sulfur dioxide emitted by coal-fired power plants. In Ohio's SIP, their decision to meet these guidelines was to increase the height of the smokestacks so that the emissions that came out would go above the monitors, would be put into the wind and carried into other states, and there was a reduction in the measured sulfur dioxide in the area near the source. So then in 1977, when the EPA amended the guidelines around SIPs, they specifically said that that is not a tactic that can be used to achieve your goals. You cannot just increase the height of the smokestack. So hopefully we'll start to see something that's a little better than that when we are implementing Ohio's methane SIP. So how would a SIP work in Ohio? And while I think much of this is still uncertain, this is how we believe a methane SIP would work in Ohio. The Ohio Environmental Protection Agency would take the lead on the development. They would work in coordination with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and all of this would happen under the umbrella direction of Governor Mike DeWine and his administration. The Ohio EPA would oversee pipeline and extraction methane emissions and enforcement while interacting primarily with companies and the businesses involved in the process. They would also continue regulating permitting as they do currently. And the Ohio Department of Natural Resources would continue receiving funding to plug, to do well capping and to plug orphan wells, and would handle more the venting and flaring side of the methane rule and the implementation of those particular components. So what should be in the SIP? And I think there are a couple of different things that we would want to make sure would be there. Strategy, measures, and components necessary to achieve the goals of the federal methane rule, which includes reducing emissions from small wells, as you heard earlier, and with equipment known to malfunction, and air pollution from routine flaring. We want to make sure that all of the components are based on science and data-driven approaches to reducing emissions, provisions to protect public health. We already heard about those negative impacts, community and equity considerations to make sure that those most impacted by air pollution are taken care of, transparency and accountability for those investigating the emissions, companies making the changes, and those monitoring the reductions in emissions, and finally, public input and review. But what can we be doing right now as we're waiting really with bated breath for this rule that we've been waiting for so very long? You can take action in support of federal methane rules, reducing emissions. You're going to hear a little bit more about how you can do that later on. You can be writing letters to the editor of your local paper in support of reducing methane. We are happy to help you with that if that is something that is new for you. And you can provide comments in response to the SIP when that is appropriate. I've included my contact information at the bottom there. If you are someone in Ohio who would like to get more involved and try any of these steps toward taking action, I am more than happy to help you with that. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Kim.
Thank you, Tracy. And Ohio and Pennsylvania are the focus of this presentation because there are so many oil and gas well infrastructure in both places. And so Tracy talked a little bit about the Ohio State Implementation Plan, and Carolyn's going to talk about the Pennsylvania Implementation Plan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carolyn Heckman. Let me just get this set up real quick. There we are. My name is Carolyn Heckman. I'm the Pennsylvania Policy and Outreach Coordinator for the Evangelical Environmental Network. I will be speaking to you today about the importance of a strong methane state implementation plan, but here in Pennsylvania. There will be a lot of overlap between my presentation and Tracy's presentation, but we just want to make sure that you understand that this is very important, that we have a strong methane state implementation plan for both Pennsylvania and Ohio. So Pennsylvania is the birthplace of commercial oil production thanks to Edwin L. Drake. Drake drilled the first well specifically intended to produce oil in Titusville in 1859. His success launched a global industry upon which most of our modern lives depend. Pennsylvania's marketed natural gas production, primarily from Marcellus Shale, reached a record 7.6 trillion cubic feet in 2021, and the state is the nation's second largest natural gas producer after Texas. The industry supported over 480,000 Pennsylvania jobs and provided over $40.4 billion in wages and contributed more than $78.3 billion to the state's economy in 2019. Over half of Pennsylvania households use natural gas as their primary home heating fuel, and the state's 48 underground gas storage sites, the most for any state, help meet regional heating demand in the winter. Now that we know the current state, it's important to continue to recognize the detrimental impact methane production has on human health, especially here in Pennsylvania. The oil and gas industry is, after all, the leading industrial source of methane pollution. The health impacts are not shared equally across the Commonwealth. There are more at-risk communities such as children, pregnant women, and the elderly. For instance, studies have shown that the closer people 65 and older live to wells, the greater their risk of premature mortality. Those senior citizens who live closest to the wells had an early death risk of 2.5% higher when compared to people who did not live close to wells. Over 85% of published medical research shows serious health consequences from living up to 5 miles away from oil and gas facilities, including asthma, low birth weight, and cancer. Living within a half a mile of an oil and gas production facility is correlated with additional negative health impacts, including cancer, respiratory illness, birth defects, blood disorders, and neurological problems. 1.5 million Pennsylvanians live, and 311,000 children attend school within this threat zone. You don't have to live near a gas well to feel the health impacts. Pollution can travel long distances, compounding existing air quality problems and increasing ozone and smog, resulting in tens of thousands of additional asthma attacks each year. From all sources, methane causes at least 1/4 of the warming we are experiencing today. With warmer temperatures come increased smog, resulting in increased asthma attacks and allergies, and earlier springs and later falls, which increases chances of vector-borne disease like Lyme disease. This is a huge impact area here in Pennsylvania, with the Commonwealth being #1 in the nation in reported Lyme disease cases. And according to the American Lung Association, air quality in the cities of Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Johnstown, Lancaster, Harrisburg, and York all ranked among the 25 most polluted cities in the United States. So with all these health impacts in mind, why is the state implementation plan important? Well, SIPs provide a plan for implementation, maintenance, and enforcement of the national ambient air quality standards in each state. EPA has established that the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for 6 criteria of air pollutants, which are widespread common pollutants known to be harmful to human health: carbon monoxide pollution, lead air pollution, nitrogen oxide pollution, ozone pollution, particulate matter pollution, and sulfur dioxide pollution. Section 111 is the principal part of the Clean Air Act for regulating climate change and pollution from industrial sources. Under Section 111B, EPA standards apply directly to new and modified facilities. Under Section 111D, EPA and states work together to cut pollution from existing sources, which make up the mass majority of facilities in both industries. Accordingly, when regulating existing sources, EPA starts by issuing emissions guidelines, a rule that defines the best system of emission reduction and the emission reductions achievable with that system. The guidelines set timetables for states to submit plans containing standards and deadlines for sources to meet those standards. EPA reviews plans and approves them as satisfactory, those that meet the requirements. EPA issues a federal plan if a state doesn't submit any plan or an unsatisfactory one. Pennsylvania's final form regulation will be due to the EPA as a SIP revision after EPA's issuance, which falls under the responsibility of the PA Department of Environmental Protection here in Pennsylvania. The EP regulates new sources of emissions of methane from oil and gas extraction activities under the Air Pollution Control Act and regulations adopted under the Act, its air quality permitting program, and by implementation of certain codified and federal regulations. Similar to Ohio, but only with one entity, PADEP will oversee everything from pipeline and extraction methane emissions and enforcement to interacting primarily with companies and continue to regulate permitting. The DP will also receive money for well capping and will continue the venting, flaring, implementation side of things. Now that you have all this information, what can you do next to make a difference? Well, you can take action today and sign EEN and Mom's Clean Air Force methane action alerts. We'll be sharing those links in the chat. You can share posts on social media or create your own. And don't forget to tag your legislators and or governor in your new methane TikToks. Another option is to write or submit LTEs or op-eds to your local paper in support of reducing methane. Lastly, you can also provide comments in response to the SIP implementation plan. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Now we will move into questions.
Yes, so we've had some good questions come up in the chat, and I think we have a few minutes to answer some of them. One of the questions that came up, I believe John already answered a bit, but John, I think it would be helpful to repeat this so other folks on the webinar could hear. Cam asked, could a future administration roll back cuts or funds that the Inflation Reduction Act currently provides?
Thanks, Lindsay. Yes. I mean, it's a great question, obviously, because there is a concern over that. So the answer is a multi-part. So yes, technically it could be repealed, but luckily it's been set up in a way that, provides a lot of incentives to industry and, to other, to communities to act upon, going into a decarbonized energy future. So with the support of business and industry and communities and governments that are receiving all this funding, we think because of these carrots, I guess, for lack of a better term, that, it's very unlikely that that would happen because of the support. But great question. And we hope, obviously, to continue to elevate the IRA and the great work that it's doing just to show how important it's been for communities as well.
Thank you, John. Another question that came up, both Tracy and Carolyn talked about commenting on the state implementation plans. What is typically the timeline for that? And how will folks know when they're available to do a comment?
We will make sure that when the comment period is open, that everyone is aware of it. We will send out notifications and be communicating those to the public.
Yeah, and they are very specific when that time period opens up as to exactly how long you will have and what the process is. So we'll make sure that everybody has the information, as Carolyn said.
And to expound upon it a little bit, the implementation process for states will be an 18-month process. So, while it sounds like a lot of time, that we'll be working through that 18-month period. But yes, Tracy's right. There is a technical public comment period that they will go through in each of these states. And so we'll make sure that we keep everyone abreast of all of that.
Great. Thank you for that extra information. Another good question from Cam that was in the chat. what are common deflections or what about isms that you often hear related to methane topics?
I can speak to a few. One common one is that this will cost too much for industry and smaller operators to comply with rulemakings like this. Those are very common that come up, but I mean, most of these actions that will be required under the supplemental EPA methane rule are being undertaken by the majority of the larger industries to begin with. Most can be done at little to no cost. And, the important element of that is, industry may say that, but they put out their ESG reports annually that talk about the great work they're doing in recognition of methane reductions. So we try to counter that, and that's really where all of our partners here come in together, is that we recognize these will come up, but we base our answers in research and science, in order to counter that. But that's truly a very common one, and I can tell you that is a concern that we have in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and are working very hard to counter that argument.
Part of that science is, just as a reminder from the study that was discussed earlier, is that we also see how much these companies are losing in wasted gas by not taking better care of their equipment, making sure that they're eliminating leaks. In Ohio alone, it was $93 million. So there are cost savings measures that they can be taking at the same time.
I think another thing to think about, and another question that people sometimes ask, is what about the other things that contribute to climate change? And I think the power of this sort of methane ecosystem conversation and of thinking about these things as part of bigger systems is the work that we need to do and the progress we need to make in order to slow climate change is enormous. And we need all of these things. All of these things play a part, and they work together. And the really powerful part about methane and this conversation in particular is that we get these added benefits to frontline communities. So it goes beyond just this conversation of climate change, which is so, so important and has major impacts for health as well, but really speaks to how do we also look at frontline impacted communities? How do we also look at air pollution? How do we also consider these things as we make progress? And I think that's what's really powerful about the methane story, and what can really sort of counteract some of the conversations about what about.
Thank you all. I think those were some really good points. Another question that came up in the chat from Dean is the train that derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, passed through my neighborhood in Cleveland. Is there any sense of how Norfolk Southern is responding to the call for increased safety regulations, and are they taking it seriously?
Pastor Van Farrow with the heavy hitting there. So East Palestine, obviously fresh in the mind as an Ohio resident, recognize that. I would, what I can say is that at least in Ohio, we've seen both Senator Brown and Senator Vance present legislation that to address and ensure that there are more safety regulations around this. So, I mean, I think this gets back to the reason why we, encourage you to attend a webinar like this, so we can empower you to do outreach to those elected officials that represent you in all of your states to, say, listen, this is a concern of mine. I would like to see more safety regulations put in place, and really truly touches on, the frontline impacts that people may not recognize. But another important point of that is, that impacted Pennsylvania as well. So, I mean, all of this is a cross-border, problem. So I can't speak to Norfolk Southern and their concern, but I can speak at least to the power of what, our elected officials are trying to do and where you would fit into that ecosystem.
I would just like to add that as I was preparing my presentation talking about underground storage wells and how the one that leaked in my county is a pretty remote area, but many of them are in much more populated areas. I was thinking about the East Palestine train, and the fact that it passed through Cleveland about an hour before it got to where it did, and the impact that it could have had in a much more populated area could have been tremendous.
Definitely. That's a good point, Kim. Well, those were all the questions that we had in the chat. I know we're coming up on time, so I'll hand it back over to you, Kim, to wrap us up.
Well, I hope you found some useful information in this today. As you know, those of us on this call are doing this work on a daily basis and find some of these nuances confusing about who is in charge of what. And so we just wanted to make sure that we could educate people on all the very important things out there that are focused on methane right now and ways that you can take some action. So we encourage you to do that. If our message or Mom's Clean Air Force message resonated with you, we encourage you to reach out, and we will be sure to help you as you want to share more information and talk to your policymakers. Thank you.